The morning Rosette Amoah stepped out of the Parkdale Community Health Center. She did not know that within the hour, someone would try to make her feel like she did not belong in the city. She had helped build one quiet act of service at a time. She was 66 years old, small in stature, but unhurried, in the way that people who have long since stopped measuring their worth by anyone else's opinion tend to move. She wore a navy blue cardigan over a floral blouse, her silver locks pinned loosely at the back of her neck, and she carried a worn canvas tote over one shoulder and a smaller insulated bag on the other arm. She had been at the health center since 7 that morning, helping organize the weekly food literacy workshop she had volunteered with for the past 11 years. The session had run long, as it often did, because the women who came had questions that deserved real answers, and Rosette had never been a person who watched the clock when someone needed to be heard. Her neighborhood, the stretch of Parkdale where she had lived for 32 years, was the kind of place that had changed dramatically around her without ever quite changing her. She had watched the coffee shops multiply, and the rents climb, and the faces at the corner stores shift with each passing year. But she still knew the names of the children on her block, still kept a box of groceries near her front door for anyone who needed it without saying so, and still walked the same route to the same market. On the same Saturday morning, she had walked for longer than some of her neighbors had been alive. She liked the walk. She liked the particular rhythm of a city morning. The smell of bread from the Portuguese bakery, 2 blocks east, the sound of the streetcar grinding around the Roncesvalles curve, the way the light fell differently on autumn mornings than on any other kind. At the Renfrew Market Hall on King Street West, a newly renovated specialty food market that had opened in the space of what used to be a neighborhood hardware store, Rosette was a familiar figure. The woman who staffed the cheese counter knew her order before she placed it. The young man at the olive bar always set aside a container of the Castelvetranos she favored because she had once told him they were the only olives her late husband had ever truly enjoyed, and he had not forgotten. She stopped near the entrance to admire a display of late-season peaches from a Niagara orchard, turning one over gently in her hand to check the give of the skin the way her own mother had taught her decades ago in a kitchen that smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. She was known here, she was trusted here, and she did not know, as she moved through the aisles, with her familiar quiet ease, that 2 sets of eyes had already found her and were following her in a way that had nothing to do with warmth or recognition, and everything to do with a kind of suspicion that required no evidence to ignite itself. The security guard's name was Kyle Mercer, 29 years old, 3 months into a contract position with a private firm hired to patrol the market's interior. He was the kind of young man who confused authority with certainty, who had learned somewhere along the way that confidence without knowledge was a passable substitute for competence if you held it firmly enough. He had been watching Rosette since she picked up the peach. He had clocked the 2 bags on her shoulder. He had done a swift, unkind calculation in his head that had nothing to do with anything she had done and everything to do with what he assumed she might. Beside him, Darren Quist, the market's floor manager, 36 years old and overly protective of a job he had held for less than 8 months, leaned in and murmured something. Kyle nodded. Neither of them paused to ask a single question of themselves that might have interrupted the conclusion they had already reached. Rosette was standing in front of the prepared foods section, reading the handwritten card beside a tray of roasted root vegetables, when Kyle stepped into her line of vision and cleared his throat. "Ma'am." His tone had that particular flatness that comes not from politeness but from its performance. "We're going to need you to come with us." Rosette looked up at him with the patient, watchful expression of a woman who had spent 66 years learning to read a room before the room fully revealed itself. She set the card down carefully. "I beg your pardon," she said, her voice gentle and clear. Darren stepped up beside Kyle, his arms crossing in that performative way that floor managers sometimes adopted when they wanted to appear decisive without actually committing to anything. He informed her that the store had received a concern, that her bags had been flagged, that it was standard procedure, and if she cooperated, it would all be sorted out quickly. Rosette stood very still. Around her, the ordinary sounds of the market continued. Someone laughed near the wine section. A child asked for something in a high, bright voice. The world was proceeding as though nothing at all unusual was happening. "I've been shopping here since this market opened," Rosette said, still quietly, still evenly. "I'd like to know what concern. I haven't taken anything." Kyle told her they needed to check her bags. "Right now," he added, as though the emphasis were a kind of authority in itself. She offered to open both bags willingly, right there, in full view of anyone nearby. She said it simply, without theater, with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had nothing to hide and understood that cooperation was not the same as compliance with something unjust. But Kyle had already reached forward, and in the motion of taking the canvas tote from her shoulder, he misjudged either his own strength or her footing, and the strap pulled hard enough against her arm that she stumbled a half-step sideways, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the edge of the display shelf. The insulated bag slipped from her other arm and dropped to the floor. A jar of fig jam from inside it rolled under the display and came to rest near the toe of a stranger's shoe. The woman who had been reaching for a jar of honey a few feet away lowered her arm and did not move. A man near the bread display turned and then looked away again, his hand tightening around the handle of his basket. The child who had been asking for something had gone quiet. In the sharp, suspended pause that followed, the market held the particular silence of a space that has collectively witnessed something wrong and has not yet decided what to do about it. Rosette straightened herself. Slowly. Her hand pressed to the shelf for a moment longer than she needed it to be. "That," she said softly, looking at Kyle directly, her voice steady in a way that cost her something, "was not necessary." And it was at that moment, in the trembling quiet that followed, that a woman near the entrance of the market lifted her phone and dialed a number she had called only 3 times before, in 11 years of knowing Rosette Amoah, the number of Rosette's daughter. Amaka Nwofor had been sitting at the head of a glass-walled boardroom on the 28th floor of a tower on Bay Street when her phone lit up with a number she knew but rarely received calls from. She was 43 years old, lean and composed, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a deep burgundy blouse. A woman whose stillness in high-pressure rooms had become something her colleagues referenced in the shorthand of professional admiration. She had built Viridian Systems from a 2-person operation in a shared office on Spadina Avenue into one of the largest financial technology companies in the country. She had done it in 11 years, starting with a $12,000 line of credit she took out at 28, working 7 days a week from a rented room in the East End of the city, building a company that changed the way credit was assessed for people that traditional systems had always found easy to overlook. She had been on the cover of Report on Business. She had testified before a Senate committee on financial inclusion. She had been described, in print, as one of the most consequential technology entrepreneurs Canada had produced in a generation. None of that was in her mind when she looked at the screen and recognized the caller's number. She stepped out of the boardroom without a word. The voice on the other end was steady but tight, the kind of tight that comes from someone holding something difficult at arm's length so they can keep speaking through it. It was the woman who managed the food literacy program with her mother. She described what she had just watched happen in the Renfrew market. She said the words slowly, making sure they landed whole. Amaka listened without interrupting. She asked one question. Then she was already moving toward the elevator. She reached the market in 14 minutes, which was not possible by any reasonable measure of downtown Toronto traffic, and she did not think once about the meeting she had left or the agenda items still unresolved on the table behind her. She walked in through the main entrance with a focused, quiet speed that several people would later describe as the kind of movement you notice. Not because it is loud, but because it is absolutely certain of its destination. She found her mother standing near the customer service desk. Rosette was holding her recovered bag against her side. Kyle and Darren stood a few feet away, maintaining the posture of men who had not yet grasped the full dimensions of what they had done. A store associate nearby looked profoundly uncomfortable. Two customers who had chosen not to leave were watching from a careful distance. Amaka crossed to her mother first. She placed both hands gently on Rosette's arms and looked at her face, reading it the way she had learned to read it over 43 years of being this woman's daughter. "Are you hurt?" she asked, quiet, just for her mother. Rosette shook her head slightly, but something in her eyes told a more complicated story. The particular exhaustion of a person who has had to be dignified in circumstances that never deserved their dignity. Amaka held her mother's gaze for one more moment. Then she straightened and turned. "Which one of you put your hands on her?" she asked. Still quiet, still the same tone she used in boardrooms. No theater in it at all. Kyle stepped forward with the automatic confidence of a man in uniform who had not yet learned that uniforms are not always the highest credential in a room. He began to explain. Standard protocol. Concern raised. Procedure followed. He used the word policy 3 times in 4 sentences, as though repetition might substitute for justification. Amaka let him finish. Then she looked at Darren. "Are you the manager on duty?" Darren confirmed that he was. "I'm going to ask you to get your district director on the phone," she said, "and I'm going to ask the person behind that desk to pull every second of footage from the past 40 minutes. And then, I would like someone to tell me, specifically, what observable behavior in this building prompted you to physically pull a 66-year-old woman who was reading a label on a vegetable tray." There was a silence, in which the question hung with complete precision, and no one in the immediate vicinity could find a word to fill it. The associate behind the customer service desk had already begun typing. Darren had pulled out his phone and was staring at the screen as though the district director's number had suddenly become difficult to locate. Kyle's earlier certainty had curdled into something quieter and less comfortable with itself. Amaka reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and set a business card on the counter. She did not announce what was on it. She simply placed it there and left it. Darren glanced at it. Then he looked up at Amaka, then back down at the card. The name on it was not unfamiliar to him. He had seen it on a news segment not 3 weeks earlier. He had seen the building named for her company's funding announcement on a billboard on the Gardener. He had seen the photograph in the magazine that sat on the coffee table in his own home. Something in his face changed in a way that was not dignified and not kind to witness. "Ms. Nwufor," he started. "What I'd like you to do right now," Amaka said, "is call your district director, as I asked." The footage was reviewed within the hour. It was unambiguous. It showed Rosette Amoah moving through the aisles at an unhurried pace, examining products, making selections, doing nothing that could be described by any reasonable viewer as suspicious. It showed Kyle Mercer watching her from the moment she entered. It showed the exchange at the prepared food section, the reach for her bag, the stumble, the jar rolling away. It showed Rosette steadying herself against the shelf with a composure that the store's own incident report would later describe, with notable understatement, as exemplary. The footage showed everything, and it left nothing to interpretation. The district director, a woman named Paulette Greer, who had worked in retail operations for 22 years, arrived from the company's Etobicoke offices within 90 minutes of receiving the call. She reviewed the footage with the kind of controlled, careful expression that experienced managers adopt when they understand that what they are looking at will have significant consequences, and they are still computing the full shape of those consequences. When she was done, she excused herself and made 3 phone calls in rapid succession. Kyle Mercer was notified that his contract with the private security firm was under immediate review for conduct unbecoming the standards of his position. He was asked to leave the premises. Darren Quist was informed that he was suspended pending a full internal review. The decision to escalate an unverified concern into a physical interaction with a customer, without any direct observation of policy violation, was described by head office as a failure of both training and judgment. There was no softening of the language. There was no version of it that sounded like anything other than what it was. Paulette sat down across from Rosette Amoah in the market's small back office and offered an apology that she had been composing since the moment she left the gardener. It was thorough. It named what had happened. It did not attempt to redirect it or diminish it. Rosette listened. She thanked Paulette for coming in person. And then she said, quietly, that she appreciated everything that had been said, but that what she wanted most was not an apology extended only because her daughter happened to be in a position of public prominence. What she wanted, she said, was for that same accountability to be extended, sincerely and structurally, to every person who had ever walked through those doors and been made to feel like a suspect because of how they looked. Not just when someone with a business card happened to walk in after them. Paulette was quiet for a moment. "You're right," she said, simply, without qualification. By the following morning, the story had moved quickly. A customer who had been present shared a brief account on social media. A journalist who covered business and community affairs in the city picked it up by early afternoon. By evening, several Toronto outlets had run the story, and by the time the national morning programs began the following day, Amaka Nwofor's office had received more than 50 media requests. She declined every single one. Her communications director issued a brief statement on her behalf. It said only that Rosette Amoah was a woman who had given decades of service to her community without asking for recognition, that what had happened at the Renfrew market was not an isolated incident, but a pattern that too many people navigated silently and without the option of having someone with a business card walk in on their behalf, and that the most important story here was not Amaka's. It was her mother's, and the thousands of women like her. The company that operated the market announced within 48 hours that it was commissioning a full review of its security protocols in partnership with a community advisory panel. Implicit bias training would become a mandatory recurring requirement for all contracted security staff across every location in the province. A community access fund was established to support local organizations providing food programming in Parkdale and the surrounding neighborhoods. The private security firm that had employed Kyle Mercer parted ways with him formally by the end of the week. 10 days after the morning it had all happened, Rosette Amoah stood at a podium inside the community room at the Parkdale Public Library. She had not sought the invitation. The women from the food literacy program had arranged it quietly among themselves, had reached out to the neighborhood association, and the room had filled beyond its capacity, with people who wanted simply to be in the same space as a woman they had heard about, and, many of them, had known for years. She had not prepared formal remarks. She had brought a glass of water and a small stack of handwritten notes she glanced at once and then set aside. She began by talking about her mother. She talked about the kitchen in Ghana, where she had grown up, the smell of groundnut soup on Saturdays, the particular way her mother had taught her to hold herself in rooms where other people wanted her to feel small. She described arriving in Toronto at 22 with one suitcase and the address of a cousin she had met only twice. She described the first winter, the cold she had not been prepared for, and the particular loneliness of a city that was enormous and beautiful and not yet hers. She said she had spent the next 44 years making it hers. She talked about what it meant to be followed in a store. Not about that specific morning, not in detail, but about the accumulated weight of a lifetime of those moments. The way you learned to calibrate yourself. The way you made yourself smaller, quieter, less present, not because you were any of those things, but because you had learned that your peace sometimes depended on performing them. "I am 66 years old," she said, and the room was very still. "I have never taken anything that was not mine. I have spent my life giving more than I kept, and I still had to prove that on a Saturday morning while buying vegetables. She paused. The quiet that followed carried weight rather than emptiness. I don't want my daughter's name to be the reason anyone treats me fairly, she continued, her voice steady and unhurried. I want to be treated fairly, because I am a person standing in front of you. That is the only credential that should ever be required. Near the back of the room, Amaka stood against the wall with her arms at her sides, watching her mother the way she had watched her for 43 years. She had been in rooms where heads of state spoke. She had sat across tables from investors who could move markets with a single sentence. She had never once felt the particular quality of stillness that filled her now, the kind that comes not from being impressed, but from being moved by something simply and irreducibly true. She had not cried in a professional context in longer than she could remember. The tears that came quietly down her face in that room were not something she planned or prevented. She let them come, and she kept watching her mother, and she did not look away. From the podium, Rosette looked out at the assembled faces. Old faces and young ones. Faces that knew exactly what she was describing, and faces that were learning it for the first time, and faces that were somewhere in between, understanding arriving slowly, like light coming through a window not fully opened. She took a breath. I am not asking you to be angry on my behalf, she said. I am asking you to pay attention to the person in front of you at the checkout, to the woman on the bus reading her book, to the man waiting for his coffee. See them. That is all I am asking. Just see them. The room remained quiet for a long moment after she finished. Then someone near the back began to applaud, and it spread through the crowd not as performance but as release, the way applause does when what it is responding to has been honest rather than managed. In the weeks that followed, Amaka worked with a community advisory panel reviewing the market's protocols. She was not the loudest voice in those meetings. She showed up, she listened. She offered her experience of building institutional accountability from the ground up in the way she knew how to do it, steadily, with documentation, with clear benchmarks, without allowing momentum to dissolve, because someone had already issued an apology and assumed the work was concluded. The advisory panel produced a 37-page report, 7 recommendations, a timeline for each, a public commitments framework signed by the company's national leadership and scheduled for annual review by the panel itself, a standing partnership between the market and 3 Parkdale community organizations, a funded welcome program for newcomers, a written requirement, embedded in every vendor and security contractor agreement, that community relationship training be completed with facilitators drawn from the neighborhoods the building was built to serve. It was more, by any measure, than usually came from moments like this one. Rosette, when Amaka told her about the final report over the phone, said only that she was glad that the young women at the program had been asking about it, and that she hoped it would make someone's Saturday morning a little more ordinary. On a Thursday evening in early November, when the light in Toronto had gone that particular amber shade belonging specifically to the last warmth before the city commits fully to winter, Amaka sat beside her mother on the small front porch of the house on Galley Avenue, where she had grown up. She had a cup of tea. Her mother had one too. The street was quiet in the way that streets in this part of the city were quiet on weeknights. Children somewhere inside, the occasional dog, a streetcar audible 2 blocks away but not intrusive. They had not talked much since sitting down. They rarely needed to. Rosette was watching the maple tree at the edge of the small front garden. Its last leaves were barely holding. She had planted it with her late husband the year Amaka turned 2. She had watched it grow from something smaller than either of them could have imagined into something. Neither of them could reach across. You didn't have to come that day, Rosette said finally, without turning to look at her daughter. Her tone was thoughtful rather than accusatory. The tone of someone working something out. Yes, I did, Amaka said. I would have managed. I know you would have. Amaka wrapped both hands around her mug. That's not why I came. Rosette turned to look at her then. I came, Amaka said, because you are my mother, and because in my entire life, the only time I have ever seen you not manage something was when Papa died, and even then you managed. She looked at her mother in the fading light, at the face she had known longer than she had known anything else in the world. I'm allowed to show up for you. That's not a business decision. Rosette was quiet for a moment. Something in her expression softened, in the particular way it softened, only when her daughter said something she had been waiting, without knowing it, to hear. You always seem to arrive when I need you, she said softly, almost to herself. Amaka thought of the boardroom she had walked out of, without explanation. Of the 14 minutes on Bay Street traffic. Of the feeling, somewhere on King Street West, of having only one relevant thing in the world to do. I'll always come, Mama, she said. That was true before the company. It'll be true long after it. A porch light came on across the street. The maple moved in the evening air, releasing the last of its leaves one at a time, as though it were being careful about the letting go. Rosette reached over and took her daughter's hand. They sat together until the street lamps came on, and the tea went cold, and the neighborhood folded gently into the unremarkable peace of an ordinary evening, the kind that, after everything, felt like exactly enough.